Let me get back and.
Oh, sorry, we'd like to share there.
Oh, let me grab that little notebook there. Sir. The important things, the coffee mug.
Yeah, I got my little coffee here.
Nice, man. Well, this is great. Thank you so much for coming on. Just so the group knows, when we started having talks about performance testing, I called Mike. I'm like, hey, I think we should have a training series. What do you think we can do? And we sort of landed on Lactate to start. And then Mike's spoken to my class several times about metabolic flexibility, but he works with high end. I saw you just worked with Formula One yesterday. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was super fun. Yeah, they were great.
And you have just we went back and forth on the lactate specifically. We could do this on any topic because Mike's really well versed in all these. But today our focus is lactate, and you're the very first speaker in our training series. So
awesome.
Thanks for doing that. We have several coming up, and this is just 45 minutes, I guess 40 minutes now. The floor is yours. We can have a conversation. We can talk about it. But really what we're interested in is we're viewed as a high performance testing facility, and we want to make sure we're offering that level of service with this particular test. So that's kind of the frame of what we're looking at.
Awesome. So I have a few slides here. I have way too many slides, but I'm not going to go through all of them. So I will send you all the slides. There's a whole bunch more background and stuff if people want. And I have a little case study at the end. And then I think with the weird Teams thing, I can't see anyone when I'm presenting. So as I'm presenting, like just audio, just please interrupt me and we can talk about it, and I'll just leave some time for a bigger discussion at the end too. So that way we're all kind of at least similar on the same page, or we can even talk about it when we get to the case study too. So let me hit share screen here.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. And all right. And can you guys see my screen? I can't see any of you, but I should still be able to hear you.
Yes, we see your screen. That's perfect.
All right. Perfect. Cool. So my super sexy title of lactate testing and more. I couldn't think of anything else better. So what we're talking about a little bit is just considerations of lactate. Why are you really testing? Are you testing lactate, or are you testing hydrogen ions? We're using this as a surrogate marker for something else. What does the athlete want to learn from the test? What are the athlete's true bottleneck? I would argue if their VO2 max is 24 and they want lactate testing, we can test it, but would that necessarily solve their issue? Maybe not, maybe. What are kind of some of the air quotes standard tests? We'll talk about those coming up. Non-standard tests, for example, maybe you don't do a RAM test. Maybe they're a competitive rower and you just run a 2K test. Would that be good or bad? It depends on the situation. So obviously questions are encouraged, so feel free to interrupt me anytime you want. This is one of my new favorite quotes. To have faith is to trust yourself to the water. When you swim, you don't grab hold of the water, because if you do, you will sink and drown. Instead, you relax and float. So I try to think about this a fair amount I know sometimes myself, especially when I'm testing athletes and testing things, I just get a little bit too nervous and things don't go well. But if I can just take a few pauses, stop, breathe a little bit, and then, okay, yeah, I can actually probably figure out what is the thing I want to do next at that point. Long biography, blah, 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 blah. I did my PhD at the University of Minnesota. I did some presentations for DARPA. I did a master's in mechanical engineering before that. Associate professor at the Kerrigan Institute, CSCS, certified strength nutritionist, sport nutritionist, all that fun stuff. Basically, I like really dark metal, dark coffee, and dark beer. So you remember those three things, you're all good to go. Disclosures, I'm the owner of Extreme Human Performance. So I do sell certifications. Some of these slides are pulled from the PhysFlex cert. So we talk a lot about pH changes. I am testing some technology from the ShiftWave company, scientific advisor to Tecton ketone esters. and do some affiliation with Beyond Power Vulture One device. So usually when we talk about lactate, since you guys are all educated in this area, I'll kind of give it away right away. We're actually trying to measure hydrogen ions, but it turns out trying to get an accurate measure of pH in the field is a real kind of pain in the butt. So when we're talking about lactate, we are kind of really talking about changes in pH or the accumulation of hydrogen ions. And I know that sounds very simple, but I think sometimes you start talking about lactate testing, people get so hung up on lactate, which is super interesting, that they kind of forget, well, what was the reason we were testing lactate again? And I'm sure, like you've talked about in your class, is that sometimes we have a lot of stuff in exercise physiology just because it was the only thing we could measure. You know, a lot of the really early work was done on aerobic training and metabolic carts, even using back like Douglas bags, all sorts of stuff, because trying to even do that on a track was a real pain in the butt. And trying to get it with lifting and other modalities was pretty difficult. But we had bikes and we had treadmills we could put in the lab. And so we could have people sort of be in one place while they were exercising and collect data. So we still have a lot of stuff that's left over from that. Everyone's familiar with pH. Obviously, it's going to change reactions in your body. So when we accumulate different hydrogen ions, we're actually trying to alter pH in the body, which, since your body is a big bag of complex reactions, has different ramifications of what's going to happen from there. pH is actually a log scale, which I think people tend to forget. So more ions is obviously more acidic. Acid is a lower pH. And here's some of the standard pH numbers. Key part here, your body has a pH of about 7.34 to 7.45. It does not like going outside of that range whatsoever. Different fluids are a little bit different, but if this is starting to get altered, you're going to be in a world of hurt. The cool part then is the body has a ton of mechanisms to do almost everything possible to try to hold you at that part. And this may even, and I would argue, drop your performance just because we don't want to accumulate too many hydrogen ions. We may actually cap you at voluntary performance so that we don't alter it that much. So pH 7 is 10 times more acidic than an 8. So again, it's a logarithmic scale, which is very hard for humans to comprehend because we tend to just think of everything linearly. So pH 7 is 10 times more acidic than an 8. pH 4 is 10 times more acidic than a 5, and so on. Also, these are all dependent upon temperature. That makes a big difference. Yeah. So you can die by your pH being changed too much. Very low pH is an immediate cause of coma, regardless of your company name or where it's from. Right? A lot of times you will still see this in formal literature referred to as lactic. The glycolytic enzyme phosphofructokinase is pH dependent, as are almost all enzymes. And its activity decreases with decreasing pH, and thus the glucose utilization in the brain cells are impaired. So again, more data that if you're really trying to think about performance, I always view it through kind of a survival lens. Your body's going to do everything it can to survive first. If you want better performance, you probably need to teach your body how to survive better. Therefore, clinical consequences of decreasing pH, drowsiness, stupor, coma, death, etc. Very bad stuff. So 7 on the pH scale is neither an acid nor a base, so it's going to be completely neutral. Again, how low can you go? I was just curious on this. So here's a study. They had presented with less than a 7. Median pH was 6.94, and it ranged from 6.86 to 6.97. That was probably one of the lowest ones I could find in humans. So we don't have much wiggle room, even acutely, with pH changes at all. These are obviously very sick patients. pH is also associated with death. So high mortality in 45% of patients who had an arterial pH of 7.55 was 80% when their pH was greater than 7.6. So again, on both ends of the spectrum, we just don't have much wiggle room. Again, your body's going to try to do everything possible to hold that pH as close to neutral as you can. So related to our talk today, I'm only going to do 3 slides on energy production. And you guys are all masters at this. But for what we're primarily talking about here, we're taking the process of glucose. So we're primarily talking about anaerobic metabolism. We can have a debate later about aerobic versus anaerobic, and it's probably not a direct on and off switch by any means, but just makes it easier to talk about it. We've got all of our little intermediates that come along here. So we have our energy investment phase. We have to invest some energy into it. And then we start to get energy out in the form of pyruvic acid. So glycolysis, we're just going to split sugar. This is in the cytoplasm of the cell. And then we're going to have energy production. So we're going to go through the Krebs cycle, and we're going to make CO2, and then we're going to basically make stuff for the electron transport chain. So electron transport chain is where most of your ATP is going to be made. Here's all your fun reactions. And we finally get ATP out of all this little interactions going on. So these enzymes are going to catalyze all these reactions along the way. If there's any change in the pH, it's going to alter their reactions. CO2 is going to be the main byproduct, and aerobic metabolism, primarily using oxygen for energy. These could be carbs or fats. It's slower, but we're trying to get as much ATP out of it as we can. Anaerobic metabolism is faster and not necessarily oxygen being used, but we get less ATP per investment. So the key thing here is there's the amount that we get in versus out, and the big difference is going to be rate. If we need ATP much faster, we're going to rely more on this anaerobic type metabolism. We get less ATP overall, but we can get it at a much faster rate to keep up with the exercise performance. pH obviously can be changed by certain things. pH is going to be produced here. So simply we've got our glycogen, and it's going to be broken down into lactate plus hydrogen ions. Probably heard of lactic acid. It's debatable if that even really exists. If it does, it's for a very, very short period of time. And the byproducts here are lactate and hydrogen ions. Now, it so happens that this is a pretty much one-to-one linear correlation as far as I can tell. And so when we're measuring lactate, we're really using it as a surrogate marker for these pesky hydrogen ions that are screwing up a whole bunch of stuff. And of course, when we take ATP and split it, we get ADP plus hydrogen ions again. We have different buffers. Again, I've got a whole bunch of extra slides if you want to go down that pathway. The main intramuscular buffer is carnosine, which you guys are familiar with. You can use the supplement beta-alanine, which combines the body with L-histamine to form intramuscular carnosine. Also play with baking soda as another buffer. Just too much baking soda will cause massive GI upset. So if you are using that with athletes, there is some pretty good data that can be beneficial, but I've noticed with baking soda, the variability from one athlete to the next is really, really massive. So watch out for that. But it can be very useful in some people. Some athletes I may have, oh man, this is probably 9 or 10 years ago, dosed a Danish kayaker a little bit too aggressively on bicarbonate, and he said he felt like he was going to crap his pants in his little boat, and his times dropped dramatically. And I mentioned never doing any testing on it again, and he almost fired me. So just be careful with that. Local pH is going to impair local performance. This is via a myriad of ways. These hydrogen ions build up. There's some data to show they may actually impair the actin to myosin cross-bridging in and of itself, which isn't really good for performance. It's going to reduce force output. There's the burning sensation. You're literally, what I tell clients, you're literally dumping acid into the muscle itself. I have a little model that I call the 4S model. Basically, that's just saying that not only are these things substrates, they are signaling molecules and do a bunch of other functions. Lactic acid in and of itself probably doesn't exist. If it does, like we mentioned, goes to lactate and hydrogen ions very fast. Lactate itself is actually super interesting. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with George Brooks's work, who's been doing this for literally decades. So it can have metabolic effects, also has regulatory and signaling effects across the body. Especially this is PGC1 alpha is pretty interesting and can be used for fuel also. So lactate in and of itself is a really, really good fuel. Like the heart loves using lactate. The brain loves using lactate. Because if you think about what it is, it's actually a pretty high energy molecule to be used for fuel. The bugger is when you're producing it, you get a lot of these hydrogen ions at the same time. It's the hydrogen ions that are, buggering everything up. If you're interested in lactate potentially as a supplement, it is off patent now. I got a bunch of slides at the end on that. Basically, I've been trying to get someone to make lactate as a supplement for like 8 years now. Everybody thinks I'm insane, but someone will do it. The early literature is kind of split, but in theory, it should work. I think it does actually cross the gut. But anyway, you guys want to go down that path? Yeah, let me know. Bunch of myths about lactate. It doesn't cause muscle soreness, doesn't stay around all that long. Can be converted back to glucose, something called the Cori cycle. Again, kidneys love using it, heart loves using it. These oxidative fibers in the muscle love using lactate. So lactate is actually in and of itself a really good fuel. It just tends to show up with hydrogen ions that bugger everything up. Again, George Brooks does a ton of research on this. Highly recommend checking out all of his wonderful stuff. Wingate testing is one of the ways you can torture students in the lab, or test their anaerobic output. As my buddy Ben Pekulski, when he was competing in bodybuilding, like destroying the poor little bike for the Wingate test. Historically, Wingates are usually 20 to 30 seconds of just massive output. A lot of times in the lab, we use, I don't know if you guys probably have these guys too, the old school Monarch bikes, where you had a little wheel down below. You can barely see it here. You put these little weights on it, and you can calibrate it to different outputs. And you get on the bike, you have almost no load. You pedal as fast as you can. Then when you say go, you flip this little lever here, and it drops all this weight on this wheel. And then it ends up increasing the wattage dramatically. A lot of the new ones now are just EM braked, which are fine and work really well. But the key part is you're going to pedal as hard as you can classically for 20 to 30 seconds at this really high output. And as you extend these, you can actually do 60-second Wingates. I've actually done 180 seconds, which is 3 minutes on a rower, and did lactate testing after that. That was absolutely freaking abysmal. I did this part as a demonstration for a course we were teaching for the Carrick Institute at that time. So the fun part was I got to do it in front of the whole class. And 4 weeks prior, I had basically had a slight fracture in my ribs on my left side from a snowboarding incident, which made breathing really difficult. And then after you finish this horrible test, because it's a rower, it's hard to prick anything to get a reading right away because it's 180 seconds continuous. You have to sit there and not move, and then they prick your finger and take lactate measurements. So again, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. In general, for the Wingate testing, as you go a little bit longer, you're generally going to produce a little bit more lactate. If you're doing a really, really short test, again, you may not necessarily end up with high levels of lactate just because the test is just so short, even though it's a really high output and feels absolutely freaking miserable. So here's our considerations. What are you really testing, right? So we answered this. You are actually really testing lactate because that's what the device is going to give you in terms of millimoles. My argument is that we're kind of trying to use that as a surrogate for these pesky hydrogen ions, but we don't have a really good test in the field for hydrogen ions. This is a big one I think people forget. What does the athlete actually want to learn? A lot of times they've heard that, ooh, lactate testing is cool, and they don't really know anything else. But then you've got your ultra nerdy, usually cyclists, things like that have, everything titrated down to a gnat's butt of, how much power output they have, and they've got power meters and string gauges on their bike and all sorts of crazy stuff. Yeah, and that side, it might be useful. But also keep in mind, does this change day to day? How well rested was the athlete? Usually, if you're going to do this type of testing, I'm going to ask them, are you interested in kind of what I would say is the absolute output, or are you kind of interested in a number kind of used more for your training? If you want the absolute highest number you can possibly get, you're probably going to want to do some type of tapering with your training before. You're not going to want to pound yourself into the dirt and then show up and try to do a lactate test. If, however, you're in kind of a eustress training model, your stress is okay, you're not really ramping up or down, you're just kind of a little bit more curious where you would end up, yeah, then you could probably do it with just, 1 or 2 days off before or something like that. You're probably okay. But I think the overall training status coming into the test is something you would want to discuss with the athlete, and then they can decide what are sort of the pros and cons of that. What is probably the athlete's true bottleneck? It may not necessarily be lactate. Like I said, if your VO2 max is 24, oh man, I don't think lactate is your issue, right? Because how I think of it is VO2 max is sort of like your 1RM for your aerobic system. If it's really low, you're not going to have a ton of super high power output. If you look at, for example, track cyclists or even, cyclists of any form, there's many other sports this applies to also. Those who have usually the highest power outputs generally have a pretty good VO2 max. Now, again, it's not always the highest VO2 max, but it's generally pretty good. So if your VO2 max is absolutely horrible, that's probably going to be your rate limiter and your number one thing to work on. Now, again, if they understand that and then they're like, yeah, I'm just still curious where I'm at, cool. Yeah, go crazy. Who am I to tell you not to do it? But I think sometimes people have heard that lactate testing will give them the keys to the castle and tell them everything that's wrong with their performance. And then they do it and they're like, oh, it didn't really answer all my questions. We'll go over a couple of what I call standard tests. And then, like I said, the non-standard tests. So the key here is that most standard tests are some form of a ramp test. Just like you would do for VO2 max, there's all sorts of different ramp tests you can use. And you're going to start low and you're just going to go high in different steps as you go up. The good part about this is you're going to be able to get different measurements as you go along the way. So if you were running this on a metabolic cart, as you guys all know, at the lower levels, I can get some pretty good idea about how they're using fat, and it's going to cross over to carbohydrates, etc. I can look for their crossover point. Kind of same idea with lactate. And then also before any of these tests, you want to make sure you do a pretty good warm-up. So this is kind of much more standard. There's a lot of standard ramp tests. This is historically kind of how lactate testing has been done. However, you could make an argument that if someone is using just primarily the erg and they're sort of an indoor rowing athlete, and the gold standard for that's the 2K test, it might be worth maybe just having them do a max 2K test and look at what the maximum amount of lactate they could hit. Now, again, the modality also matters. If you're running or you're biking or you're rowing, getting access to be able to do sampling during the test may or may not be feasible. Like I said, with rowing, it's darn near impossible to do a lactate test during the row. Like, what are you going to do? Their hands are on the thing. They're moving back and forth. If they're on a bike, yeah, you could probably, get their finger or prick their ear or do something to get a measurement there. So the modality is going to make a big difference also in terms of just what is actually feasible to do. The other part, I know you guys will review the standard thing of how to do the test, make sure if you're doing, say, the finger, make sure it's clean, all that kind of stuff. You can play around with this yourself. If you get any little bit of sweat or anything in there, it will dramatically change your outcome. So if you're testing and all of a sudden you get a number that's just completely wacky, odds are it was probably just not the best test. So and when someone's exercising and sweating a lot, that does potentially become an issue. Some of the different types of lactate testers, the little test strip you stick in there, some of them are much more picky than others. I don't know why, I've just noticed that. So play around with it yourself before you do a test. Test your friends, do whatever you can just to get some more reps doing the actual thing. Here's kind of what they have for a standard test. This is after they've done all their warm-up. Progressively harder stages, 3 to 5 minutes each. You're going to look at power, pace, heart rate. You're going to measure lactate, of course. Cycling, roughly 20 to 30 watts per stage. Again, there's a huge amount of variance on these. Rowing, 20, 30 watts per stage. Running. Again, these are just rough back of the envelope type things. You kind of have to know what is sort of their max output in order to effectively do it. because you want it long enough where you're going to basically hit a high level of performance and hold that for a few minutes. If the test is end up being, like I said, the Wingate ones and really, really, really short, you're probably not getting enough lactate. If the testing drags on for forever, now they have so much fatigue that's accumulated, you're really not getting to a true max. So just like you do a VO2 max test, same idea, you want to actually be able to get a true max or pretty darn close to it. Obviously, you're going to grab a blood sample, run it through your little analyzer, see where you're at in millimolars. There is a slightly different one they use for rowing. Step duration, they typically do 4 minutes. Rest between steps, they do 30 seconds to 1 minute. And this, again, is to collect the blood sample, record heart rate, and then reset the workload. So the rowing one that is typically done, it is a sort of a pause protocol because you have to try to get the sample. So you would try to titrate this to the same number each time. But because of that, you're going to have a little bit more rest, and it's not really going to be a continuous test, which again is fine because we're just trying to find, this curve of lactate of what's actually going on. Usually typically 6 to 7 stages, get your lactate, all your other measures. So endpoints, what are we actually looking at this? Usually, again, is this 100% standard? Kind of. This is considered the first notable rise from baseline, which is typically around 2 millimolars of lactate. This is what's typically called your aerobic threshold. We can discuss in just a minute all these different markers and thresholds and everything else. Typically, if you're just doing your 2-zone, LT1, LT2, this is your anaerobic threshold. This is where you see a sharp increase. This is often around 4 millimolars, or the point before this exponential rise. So whenever you're looking at lactate curves, they don't tend to be nice straight lines. They tend to be low, going up, and then whoop, they go up exponentially. Generally, max 12 to 15 in well-trained athletes. If they did a max test and it was you're pretty darn sure it was a true max test, and their max lactate was 3 millimolars, I would say either you screwed up on the test or something's wrong, or they're probably just not as high-level athlete as what they thought. Again, rowing, you're just going to plot lactate versus power. Again, you're looking at thresholds. Again, they use pretty much the same one, about 2 millimolar, about 4 millimolar. And then the cool part here is that the reason where lactate training is beneficial is we're going to try to derive the zones from the power, heart rate, and lactate. So real simply, how I think about it is if you're doing a very long race, you want to see, okay, what is the highest output I can sustain for 1, 2, 3 hours or longer? Lactate training does give you some pretty cool information about that because the curve itself is this kind of exponential thing. If I'm hanging out like way down here, I'm probably a little bit too slow. But at some point, if I'm hanging out way up here, now I've got way too much lactate and pesky hydrogen ions, and that's definitely going to drop my performance over time. So I kind of want to be in this, below what they call this anaerobic threshold, where I can still get a high power output, but I'm not seeing this exponential rise in lactate and hydrogen ions. So that's the main reason people are using this type of testing. There's a case study, and we'll answer any questions you guys got. 16 years old. Here's all his specs, all that kind of stuff. I did not have VO2 max on this, unfortunately. His max lactate was 11.8. So if I don't know anything else at all, I would say probably a pretty darn good athlete. Like your people off the couch are not going to hit near 12 millimolars on a lactate test. Max heart rate was 200 beats per minute. And then his max power output was crazy. So on a rower, he's doing probably about a 610 2K, which is bonkers, especially at 16 years old. So here's this curve. And what's cool about this, when you have power output, you can match this to power. So here's his lactate. And what we see is this nice exponential rise. Here's the different points that they did when they did it. And then we can also look at heart rate relative to power. So some people will then try to map heart rate back here, and then we can try to determine from heart rate, because we're not going to be able to use lactate every time, and also looking at power to get an idea of different training zones where this athlete should particularly train. Here's all the specs up here above, what they did for the test. And the cool part here is they classified them into different training zones. So you've got kind of your real submax, getting a little bit higher. Here's our anaerobic threshold data. And then here's your high output, high intensity work, right? So this is definitely not sustainable here. Here we're getting to right about at that point where we're seeing that accumulation. And then here is going to be much more submax. So the nice part about this is if you want to do what's classically called threshold work, probably going to be somewhere right around in here. If you want to do your zone 3, zone 2, you're going to be much more down on this end. And if you want the interval training where you're really trying to get this maximum output for shorter amounts of time, you're going to be up in this training zone. So again, it's just a way to try to quantify what training zones you should be at so you can take a little bit more data-driven approach to it. Last part, and we'll answer any questions here. There's a whole nother debate about should we even bother using lactate testing? If we have metabolic cart data, this is a Pinoy system. This is actually my system because I have a bunch of metabolic cart and Moxie systems in my house and the training systems here. This is using NIRS technology that's looking at a light shined into the muscle, and it's actually telling us SMO2, so the levels of oxygen actually at the muscle. So we can kind of get the same idea and similar curves. They don't necessarily match up one-to-one, but this you can run almost any time you want because it's not invasive. It doesn't really cost you anything. Again, that's a whole separate topic for another day, but I just want to mention it because if you start looking into what people are doing in the real world, you will see a huge debate about using NIRS versus using lactate. They both kind of have their pros and cons, but I just mentioned it just so that you're aware of it. Cool. I will hit stop sharing here. Biggest advice I would say is just practice. Get some practice. Think about what it is you're trying to do from like kind of a first principle, and then apply the protocol to what you want to do. Talk to the athlete, see what they want to get from the test. Come to some agreement before you actually do the test. You're probably just by doing those few steps going to be in a much better place overall. I'll answer any questions you guys got.
All right. Thanks, Mike, for that overview. I think from the perspective of testing, so we're a testing facility as well, where people can pay for services and come do these things. So we get a lot of athletes, I guess, but we get a lot of triathletes and runners.
Sure.
Predominantly, I would say. Yeah. So we haven't done a lot of rowers, although at this time. And I think the debate we have a lot of times is the length of the stage and how long we should run them, because, like you said, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. And then my perspective is the longer side's been too long and they're just hanging out at that pace for too long. And so I don't know any insight on picking the length. Let's say it's a runner, because we have a lot of runners and we have to have them straddle the treadmill for as fast as we can so we can get a finger prick or an ear prick. And so stage is important for us. And then sometimes we played with how do you merge a VO2 max with a lactate threshold test, so you get kind of 2 for 1 and don't have to do 2 separate tests. So any comments around that?
I mean, my bias, and I don't have any literature to support this. If it's not elite level runners, I would tend to err a little bit on shorter stages, 2, 3, 4 minutes max. Because like you said, the hard part is I don't know if most of them sometimes don't do a lot of true high output stuff. So they don't really know what their top end is. And so that becomes a little bit tricky, and you don't want them going on forever and just being absolutely fatigued. So I mean, my back of the envelope would be 3 to 4 minutes. I mean, I think in a perfect world, if you can get a VO2 max at the same time, I think it's super helpful. That's why I ended up going to the Moxie with the Pinoy system, because I can get SMO2 and VO2 max. So I can get muscle specific markers and systemic stuff all at the same time. The downside, like you said, is to get the lactate measurement during it, you'll kind of have to stop the test for a period of time. I know technically the ramp protocols and stuff for VO2 max don't include that, but I don't think it's really that much of a negative. Like, yes, you're getting a little bit more rest, but if you go back to what is the true definition of a VO2 max, right? You're just trying to see what is the maximal level of oxygen you hold at steady state. So I don't really think it's changing the test all that much. The big caveat is if they go somewhere else and have that test repeated and they're not having those breaks, it's probably going to alter their test because you are adding a little bit more rest periods to it when you're trying to prick them to get the lactate meeting.
Okay. I think we have similar views on that. And if you have comments, yeah, I'll jump in here because you guys are doing the testing. So when this got sparked, what was the? Difference between finger prick and ear.
Oh, the honest answer is I don't know, but I think they're different. There was an old study, and I'll be darned, I spent years trying to find the freaking thing that I believe tested lactate at the same time from different sites. And I want to say they got pretty substantial different readings, but again, I cannot find that study for the life of me. So I'll go poke around again and see. I could have maybe hallucinated that whole study, but because yes, blood flow is very rapid, but we know blood flow is very locally controlled. And I just have this feeling that it's going to be slightly different. So I would pick one site to use and I probably would not change it. What would be super fun, which I haven't done this study, to be honest, would be, could you poke two sites at almost the same time and see if they're really different? I don't know. Maybe just do a short pilot where like, hey, some poor grad student, we're going to poke their ear and their finger at the same time and see.
You got a lot of those around here.
Yeah,
that would be
interesting.
An easy paper.
Yeah, I mean, like stuff like that. Like, I don't find a ton of data that's a very basic question that you would think we would have an answer to or would have been done multiple times by this point. And maybe it exists and I just haven't seen it, which is entirely possible. I just can't point to a single paper right now.
When we look at where we would mark somebody as the lactate threshold, and I know LT1, LT2, or like you were saying, the traditional 4 millimole, like the Obla.
Yeah.
We've gone back and forth with 4 millimole versus a standard change from the previous measure and trying to figure out where do we actually mark this. It sounds like you are more along the plotting it and looking at the inflection point and then calling that Obla. What's your thought?
My bias is I use the inflection point because that's literally what you want to know, right? You want to know on that part of the curve where you're here, and now within a very short period of time, you start becoming vertical and start accumulating a ton of lactate. Like for training, that's actually what I want to know. Like I put the numbers in there because these are the numbers you see all the time. It's like, hey, if we knew it was 2 millimolars and 4 all the time, why the hell would we do the testing? I think those are just the averages that it kind of comes out to be and where to look for it. But I just graph everything out and I'm looking for that inflection point. That's actually what I'm looking at to see where does that happen.
Where you put on the curve, like right where it starts increasing.
Yeah, so there should be 2 inflection points, and the second one is where we're calling threshold.
Like just where it starts to go up.
Yeah. Right. So one of the things we've had trouble with interpreting is if our stages are long and you have this measure in a stage, what number are we using for their power? Because sometimes you go to the previous stage, before they've hit that number. Like say they hit that number at the end of the stage. Was it that stage that is the lactate threshold, or is it the previous stage where we take that as like the power that we're using for training numbers?
Yeah, I tend to take the previous number with the caveat being this is probably more sub-threshold is how I would interpret it, right? Because the error is maybe I didn't extract quite as much output as I could by being a little bit lower. But if I overestimate that, they're going to blow up like 10 minutes into the thing and be pissed at me. And they're probably going to be pushing too hard because they're getting too close to that exponential part of the curve. And the other part also is that this is just one-off testing. Like I would love to see repeated testing on this, because my feeling is, at least from SMO2 data, it varies like time to time. Like I've gotten completely different SMO2 data within 2 days of testing the same person on the same protocol. So again, I think there's more variability in reality than what we're seeing. And we tend to, myself included, over interpret this one-off testing. And I explain to athletes, like this is to try to get you a ballpark. Like if I give you this number and you're out running and you feel like you're going to blow up and you can't hold that output, I don't care what the testing in the lab 2 weeks ago showed. Like you're probably up on that higher end part of the curve on that day for God knows whatever reason.
Yep. One of the things with the stage lengths, like I've always thought, I get it, like we're supposed to be into some type of a steady state in that stage.
Yeah.
But if they were shorter, then I would know a better number to provide as that power number. So I guess the thought, I'm just thinking out loud, the thought is that we need to have them be steady state for that 3 to 4 minute period so that we know it's not just a change from the previous power output. Is that right?
Yeah. The other thing in my head I look at is how well can they, again, depending upon what system you're using, are you forcing them to hold power? Are you just trying to get them to ride at that power, etc.? But if it's varying a little bit, one of the things I look at is, okay, so if we bump up by 30 watts and you start out and let's say we're doing 4-minute stages, and the first 2 minutes you're great, and then you're really dropping towards the end of that stage, to me, that's already giving me some info that I need to know, that you're having a hard time, regardless of lactate testing or whatever testing I'm doing. It's telling me that you're having a hard time holding that power for that duration of time. So that to me is information in and of itself. And I agree. Then it's like, well, do you take the average? Do you take the first part? Do you take the end? I tend to take the lower number and kind of be more conservative with the numbers I'm giving them, just because if they're going to follow that to the T, which they probably shouldn't, they're going to be a little bit under where they should be instead of going a little bit too hot all the time. I don't know if there's a right answer to either one. I could argue the other way too.
My last question for sake of time here. We have a phlebotomy training next here in the lab.
Nice.
My thought is that we know after an intense effort that it will peak some seconds to minutes after you stop. So when are you taking the measurement during the 4-minute span, and when are you taking it when they finish?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look to see what the actual protocols say, but most athletes want to know what is their absolute lactate max. And you're correct. A lot of times that won't happen during the test. So I personally will just add a couple measurements at the end. Just stand there, do some light movement, whatever. Take a measurement in 2 to 4 minutes. I might even repeat it again. And if I just look at them and if they look like death warmed over and they're in the fetal position and they look like they're still hurting, like, 8 minutes later, I'm probably going to do a test and see where they're at. If they feel good in like 4 minutes and walking around, I'm like, yeah, I'm great. Yeah, I'm probably not going to bother. Again, I can't point to any research on that, but that's just my thoughts.
So my last, I lied. I've got one more question.
No, good.
We're currently designing a study that involves 3 repeat wind gates.
Ooh, fun.
What is it? 1 minute rest between,
Yeah.
with 1 minute rest between, with the primary outcome is that does this supplement we're going to give them affect lactate? And with the 3, you said the 1 wind gate probably not a great measure because it's not long enough, but the 3 wind gates should get us to a number that's ridiculous. So it's not looking at lactate threshold, it's just looking at lactate response. Any comments on that design?
Yeah, are you using 30-second wind gates or how long?
Yeah, 30.
Yeah. I'd say it'd be interesting. I would do obviously a little bit of pilot data to see what your max lactate is. Because what I've noticed, again, this is completely anecdotal, like your anaerobic monsters, like your NHL people, like your people who are pretty high on that spectrum, like you'll probably see some pretty high lactate numbers, like no problem, especially with that short rest period, and especially doing it 3 times, which is hideous. Your lower output people, the amount of fatigue they get sometimes is so high, they just can't hit those high relative outputs. So I don't know if you have any standard of VO2 max or any other way to see like who's actually doing the testing, but you see this in some of the beta alanine research too, right? You know, if they don't have a really high power output, they're not in that, you know, around 120 seconds to 240 seconds range. Like beta alanine doesn't really seem to be nearly as helpful as like in that kind of lactate range for people that can produce a little bit higher outputs.
Okay. It just makes me think of it, should we be doing the 30-second wing gates, or should we be doing more of like a longer staged protocol? I guess it depends on if we're looking at like, does the lactate threshold change because of the product, or does just the total amount of lactate change?
Yeah.
Based on that individual.
Yeah, I would say it depends on like exactly what you said. It depends on the question you're trying to answer, right? And that you're kind of stuck either way, because if you go to a 60-second win gate, then there's some people who can't even complete a 60-second win gate. They go so far off the cliff that you're kind of hosed there too.
Yeah. All right. Dr. Nelson, thank you for your time and giving us some input on this stuff. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. This was super fun. I really appreciate it. And I'll send you all the slides. And if you guys have any more questions or anything else I can do to help you out, by all means, please let me know.
All right, man. We'll set up the Moxie one for a future date.
Yeah, sounds good, buddy. We'll see you.
All right. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Bye-bye.